Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks a lot for coming to Sofia, to all those of you who have traveled a long way, or maybe shorter ways, but on difficult roads from around the region to come to Sofia on this very hot day. I hear that in the western part of the peninsula it's even hotter, so I guess we should not be complaining if our kind of situation in comparison is always on the Balkans we say it's better to have it's better to look how the neighbors are doing. It's not that important how we are doing. The event today is a very important occasion for us, and I will try to briefly tell you why. The European Council on Foreign Relations, which, as probably some of you know, is a pan-European think tank which has offices in 7 European capitals, has also one of its offices here in Sofia, and some have been asking why next to Berlin or Paris or London or Warsaw you go then to Sofia, to having an office in Sofia. And this event is a demonstration of what is the purpose of us being here. We're not a Bulgarian office only. We want to bring together the regional debate to a European forum. And this is what we're going to try to do this afternoon, to discuss 2 reviews. One is the review of the European global strategy, or the European security strategy as it was known at its conception in 2003. Back then, Javier Solana prepared this document. Since 2003, this document has underwent, the document stayed the same, but European foreign policy underwent tremendous changes, but also the challenges for Europe are totally different. There is also another review that we want to pay attention to, and this is the European Neighbourhood Policy review, which is also ongoing this year and is supposed to end at the end of 2015. It encompasses some of the countries which we're going to be talking about today, but it is also important, an important tool for European foreign policy making. It's not simply a bureaucratic process or kind of institutional engagement. It's a tool, and I think this is the best group with which we can discuss both reviews. All of you who are thinking about foreign policy in different countries in and around Europe. We will be joined a little bit later today by the High Representative of the European Union for Foreign and Security Policy and Vice President of the European Commission, Federica Mogherini, who is the author of the new draft of the foreign policy strategy of the European Union that most of you have probably already seen. We hope that this forum is going to be useful for you, that you will use this chance to discuss among ourselves, but also with her, what you think about Europe's future in terms of foreign policy actor from the point of view of Europe's immediate neighbors. And of course, from the point of view of Bulgaria, which is in a way on the crossroad, but also on the front line of many of those challenges that the EU is facing. And I'm not going to go further into this because we're going to have the Bulgarian Vice Prime Minister in charge for European Affairs, Mrs. Kuneva, and the Foreign Minister, Daniel Mitov, later today with us as well, who will, I'm sure, are going to elaborate on the topic. We will start from the east because we think this is maybe the most pressing set of issues in terms of urgency. We're going to start with the Black Sea, not only because it's time to think about the Black Sea on the 23rd of July, but also because this is a region, or I'm not sure whether it's a region, but it's in any event a huge territory which kind of focuses many of the problems that Europe has to face externally. One maybe housekeeping last remark from me. We're going to try to keep this as interactive and entertaining as possible, which means we will try to avoid long speeches and use a very kind of snappy format with short interventions and a big Q&A session after the initial interventions of each panel. Our moderators have agreed to act accordingly. And I hope you enjoy this afternoon. Welcome again. Thanks.
Thank you. So with all the good jokes being said about neighborhoods, I think I'll start with the very serious part. The first panel is called Unrewarding, Crossroads, the Black Sea countries amidst the European Union and Russia. And as you have already maybe seen, part of your materials you have a publication which has the same name. And we're very proud that a big part of the authors which co-authored the publication are sitting around this table. The idea about this book came a year ago when we thought about the nature of this region yet again, which has changed tremendously in the last 25 years. Obviously, after the end of the Cold War, we thought that this region is going to be much more based on a win-win setup where people are going to be, where countries are going to be focusing more on cooperation. It turned out that it's not going in this direction. A region, in order to grow for a region, needs either economic interdependence or it needs a common narrative. The common narrative, or at least the recent one, is lacking. The post-socialist or the post-Soviet is not attractive for peoples and countries around the Black Sea anymore. Economic interdependence, even though it is installed in the countries around the Black Sea, is being blocked in years in situations like the one we have after the war in Ukraine and with the sanctions towards Russia. So what do we do with a region like this one? I hope that we're going to get the answer to that question from Federica Mogherini, but also from the representatives of the Bulgarian institutions. But what seems to be the more interesting question to us right now is, what do the countries around the Black Sea want from the European Union, hope from the European Union, or wish for their future? And before starting the discussion with our panelists to look at these different points of view from around the Black Sea, I would hand over to Mr. Pirinski, who is a former Bulgarian Minister of Foreign Affairs and currently member of the European Parliament, for a short input.
Thank you very much, Ms. Slavkova. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome opportunity for a very timely discussion, and I will be as short as possible in order to make it as all-involving and intensive as was stated. The background note to this first panel, which I saw a couple of days ago, seems to invite us to think in the following format. What, from the point of view of the European Union, is to be done vis-à-vis the countries of the Western Balkans, the countries of the Eastern Partnership, and Turkey? And seemingly the kind of basic idea or challenge that is positioned there is to, in a way, gain a kind of race for integration in competition with, on the one hand, Russia, and on the other hand, Turkey, in order to achieve stability and sustainable development. Now, I would invite you to take a bit of a different perspective and think of both the Black Sea and the Balkans as regions, and look at what we have, and from this perspective see what would be the most appropriate approach on the part of the European Union. Basically what I have in mind, turning to the Black Sea, is looking at the format of the Black Sea Economic Cooperation, a initiative and an organization, as you know, launched back in '92 by Turkey, and aiming at its 25th anniversary next year. This year, chairmanship in office has been taken over by Romania, and the new Secretary General is a very experienced diplomat from Greece, Michael Christidis, who knows the Balkans very well, and I presume that many of you know him personally. The Balkan region, as you know, is covered by the Southeast European Cooperation Process, a process launched here in Bulgaria 19 years ago in July of '96, when Bulgaria was preparing for membership in the European Union. We had just applied the end of the year before in '95. And in the course of the association procedures, we made the case for relaunching a regional cooperation among the Balkan countries after the changes of '89. And we were able to hold this conference thanks to a very hands-on, very involved support by the group of 5 countries at the time dealing with the Balkan crisis, including the United States, Russia, Germany, France, Great Britain, and all the multilateral and European institutions. What I am suggesting as an alternative format for thinking about what we do with the countries in the Balkan area and the Black Sea region is thinking of imagining, perhaps, a new macro-regional European strategy, meaning the development of another European macro-region covering the Balkans and the Black Sea, which would be all-inclusive, and which would follow in the modes already functioning in the Baltics, the Danube area, and as you know, just the instituted Adriatic-Ionian macro-region. Now, I realize that this idea might sound, to say the least, outlandish, but I believe that this is a venue and a format where one could permit oneself to be a bit imaginative. Bulgaria has taken over now the chairmanship in office of the SECP for a full year. On the website of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, it is declared that the 3 priorities of the Bulgarian chairmanship will be connectivity in all its aspects, media freedom, and migration and refugees. Clearly, all these are on the agenda of the European Union. Clearly, there is every interest of interacting as actively as possible with this regional format. And since it was mentioned I'm from the European Parliament, I would not like to miss the parliamentary dimension of these 2 regional formations. There is a parliamentary assembly of the Black Sea countries, and just last year in Bucharest, a new parliamentary assembly was launched of the Southeast European countries. I believe I'm at the outer limits of the 5 minutes Ms. Slavkova has accorded to me, so I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. talking about regional formats, and there are a lot of ideas and a lot of existing, such as you just outlined. My question would be then to our first panelist, are they working in times like ours? And the question goes to Andrey.
Well,
and of course, I'm looking for the Russian perspective.
Well, the Russian perspective, I think it's tremendously important in this context, but I'm sorry to start on a rather pessimistic note, because I think that we need to take Russian role in international relations in general on a global and structural level. So the problem is not regional, the problem is structural. And my take here is that Russia, in fact, is the only nation state that is able to question the very foundations of the international system as it was established after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the Soviet Union, especially its normative elements that constitute a very important element of our understanding of what is Europe, what is the West, etc. So my first point is that we really need to take Russian role in a kind of much more global and structural context. Coming back to the question of what does Russia need or what does Russia want in this situation? Well, I would say that Russian agenda is quite simple. Russia wants to come back to a traditional Westphalian nation-state-based system with no supranational institutions like the European Union or NATO, or at least with no strong role for these institutions. And on the level of practical policies, in many regions, in the Baltic Sea region, in the Caucasus, that's exactly what Russia tries to do, to publicly portray both the European Union and NATO as futile institutions, which are of no help to those who aspire to be members of these institutions, but in the meantime, very dangerous, one, since they are encroaching upon what Russia thinks is the key for its role in international relations, and this is spheres of influence. In Europe, Russia definitely wants Americans out. That's also quite clearly articulated in the Russian agenda. And again, the idea of spheres of influence is one of the most clearly articulated in the Russian discourse. And what is even more dangerous is that what Russia says, based on the example of Ukraine, is that the only alternative to military confrontation is spheres of influence. So how to deal with this reality? Well, to be brief, I would say that first of all, we need to get rid of wishful thinking, which unfortunately dominates public discourses in many countries. In my view, the situation dangerously reminds the Cold War, and we need to face this. Of course, the European Union as an institution is just structurally unable to deal with many challenges that Russia kind of poses, but still that would be an important point for understanding of where we stand. And again, Putin sometimes is very clear and very straightforward in articulating this agenda. He justified the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. This is just empirical fact. He justified the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan and even the Soviet intervention in Czechoslovakia. The Kremlin accused the Federal Republic of Germany in annexing the German Democratic Republic and Ukraine in annexing Crimea 23 years ago. The Russian state started the legal process of delegitimizing the so-called secession of 3 Baltic states from the Soviet Union, etc., etc. So unfortunately, the trend is very clear. What can be done in this situation? Well, I think too much attention to Russia would be exactly what Putin wants. And maybe it makes sense to a little bit refocus attention from Russia to those countries that would like to be good and cooperative allies of the European Union and NATO, especially countries like Ukraine, like Georgia, Moldova. In this sense, the Black Sea region seems to be one of the most natural places for a kind of renewal of the region building attempts.
Thank you very much. Speaking, you just mentioned getting rid of wishful thinking. And for whatever reason, I had to think of Armenia. So I would hand over to Richard to tell us how tough is it actually to be in the Black Sea region between Russia and the European Union, with 2 out of 4 borders being sealed, and how costly are the choices that Armenia needs to do?
Well, thank you very much. I'm one of the few Armenians who actually doesn't speak Russian, and that is somewhat revealing and indicative that, unlike the narrative, Armenia being very firmly pro-Russian, it is significantly less pro-Putin. And in effect, there is a new trend demonstrating changes in the South Caucasus, which is still very much a region at risk, but looking at Russia's position increasingly of weakness, not strength, of a dangerous overextension of Russian hard policy, and a counterproductive approach by Russia toward Armenia and the South Caucasus, where Putin, frankly, is very good at losing friends and making enemies. This, in effect, also reveals the challenge to us in terms of analysts or decision makers. The unpredictability of Putin has now become more predictable. The cost-benefit analysis that we were normally applying to Moscow doesn't apply. Putin has been following his own distorted cost-benefit analysis. What we also see is a very concerted effort by Moscow to push out and to push back against European engagement in the region. My second point is this is very much an arena of competition over cooperation, whereas the Eurasian Union, which Armenia was actually forced to join, is based on a model of coercion and pressure. In direct contrast, the European model is based on attraction and seduction, if you will. There is really no competition, however, given the short-term limited effect of Russia's reliance on pressure and coercion. What's interesting as well is the view from Armenia or the South Caucasus is, yes, of course, geopolitics. As sexy, as interesting as geopolitics is, it's not the only framework. It's as much about local economics and local politics as it is about geopolitics. And in that context, it's a mistake, it's a dangerous mistake, to blame all of our problems on Putin. Our own shortcomings, our own lack of good governance is not directly attributed or only attributed to Putin and Moscow's policy. At the same time, the EU is a tremendously significant opportunity, but it's not the answer to all of our problems. It's an instrument, not the solution. Having said that, analytically, what's also interesting is in many ways the paradox: is Russia what it is because of Putin? Is Russia a product of Putin? Or is Putin a product of Russia? And this is an interesting analytical question in terms of how to engage, or perhaps more significantly, how to contain Russia. In many ways, we need to starve Putin of the oxygen of attention. He is exhibiting juvenile, immature activity, threatening neighbors, exerting the sphere of influence along the so-called near abroad. In many ways, we make a mistake by falling into the trap, by playing according to his game. And again, in the region at risk, in the South Caucasus, the stakes are much higher in terms of even Armenia, for an example. The only country in the region to host a Russian military base, the only member of Russia's Collective Security Treaty Organization, But according to the latest public opinion poll, only 66% of Armenians are in favor of the relationship with Russia. This is extremely much less than either Moscow or the Armenian government feel comfortable with. And even among the submissive states like Armenia, where the threat of isolation and insignificance means that the danger is we become nothing more than a Russian garrison state, there is a new trend or a new blowback against the erosion of sovereignty and independence. And there are two new trends that actually offer new potential and opportunity for meeting what was spoken about before, the potential for overcoming competition and seeking cooperation. The first trend is the promise of normalization between Armenia and Turkey, and the second trend is what we recently saw, the breakthrough agreement with Iran. These are two game changers that can actually do much to stabilize and secure the South Caucasus. But in many ways, the danger is of an opportunity to be missed. And in many ways, we cannot afford in the region of the South Caucasus to miss yet another opportunity. And in conclusion, it's most important to note that there is no conclusion. This is a dynamic, not a static process. These trends are only recently underway, and the real burden is not on the EU or the West. It's on our own local so-called elites, where shortcomings in good governance or the difference between governing a country and ruling a country are no longer acceptable. Therefore, as agents of change, the real test, the real answer is not the EU, nor is it Russia. It's on our own shoulders, within the region. And finally, the reason I'm optimistic, having moved to Armenia from Washington 10 years ago, and I may be crazy, but I'm not a fool, I am optimistic that even in Armenia, it's too small to fail. It's actually a lesson in terms of the smallest country of the Eastern Partnership, where it doesn't take much and it doesn't take many for real change, and the change is now beginning. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Ghia, Nodia, I'm turning to you. Why didn't Georgia fall for the Putin or the Russia trap?
Okay, yes, Georgia never really followed Russia. And Georgia is traditionally considered as sort of the most committed European in aspirational sense. One could argue how European we are in our practices as institutions. It's all that debate is always going on in Georgia, but in aspirational sense, we are certainly the strongest Europeans. And I think that cannot be explained by just some, purely pragmatic considerations. But there is some kind of general, maybe, pragmatic consideration in the sense that Europe is a story of success, and Russia is not a story of success. And I think it's very important to somehow keep it that way, not keeping Russia out of being a story of success when it comes to its really legitimate interest, not it sometimes considers legitimate interest, but to keep Europe's story of success, objectively, of course, but also as perceived by Georgians or Armenians or Ukrainians, etc. And here I think there are some dents, let's say so, in the image of Europe, which are there. I think they are perceived, of course, within Europe, but they are also perceived in our region and in Georgia. And as a result of that, we see some kind of some level of weakening, at least, of this kind of iron-clad commitment to Georgia becoming European and member of European and Euro-Atlantic community, and seeing it as the only only way, the way without alternative, as kind of fully dominant in the political discourse. If we look at public opinion polls, we don't see big difference. Georgians are still overwhelmingly in support of European Union and on NATO as well, of Georgia's integration in those organizations. And if you look at map of political players, it's also more or less the same in the sense of all major political actors having that consensus that this is this should be the strategic way of Georgia, and however contested and acrimonious our internal political life is, and confrontational, still on this point, major political parties are still together. But on the other hand, we feel some change in the air, in the sense that openly anti-European rhetoric is becoming much more legitimate, also in the political elites, while our relatively new government since 2012 is in its kind of official policy pro-European. It includes some parties in its coalition and some figures who openly contest this choice. And in general kind of elite discourse level, you hear more and more voices which are either openly pro-Russian or at least openly anti-Western, which usually tacitly means pro-Russian, because in Georgia there is no other kind of, on Georgian system of coordinates, nothing else exists, basically. It's either West or Russia. The reason for that is, I think, that there is some sense of, increased sense of weakness of Europe. I, of course, read this document which was sent for us beforehand on European Union in changing global environment. Here, this main idea was that the world has become more connected, contested, and complex since 2003. But I would say contested is the key word, because when it comes to complexity and connectedness, and you compare it with 2003, which is used as kind of reference point, then I would not say that it's qualitatively more complex or qualitatively more connected, but it's certainly qualitatively more contested when it comes to Europe. European ideas and very norms and institutions of Europe are much more contested, both within Europe but also in the neighborhood of Europe. I think in 2003 Europe was rather complacent, seemed all-powerful, also almost euphoric after this success of Big Bang expansion, and the feeling that nobody actually contests what Europe is about. It's just who should be allowed in or out and how far Europe extends, etc. Now Europe, I think after Ukrainian crisis, somehow admitted and recognized that it works in this contested environment internationally, and Russia is really a power that contests it.
Indeed.
But and it's also in this document that we need a clear sense of direction in that environment, which implies admissions that we don't, I mean, we Europe's, as European Union, does not have clear sense of direction. And I think people in Georgia also feel that Europe does not have clear sense of direction. And Putin, although I agree with Richard's maybe assessments of his juvenile kind of priorities, but whatever it is, Putin has clear sense of direction, and I think this contrast, which obvious contrast between somehow confused Europe and Putin that at least looks macho and strong and assertive, this undermines this very strong commitment to Europe, which is still quite strong as compared to other countries in Europe, but somehow not as strong as we used to have. Thanks.
Thank you. How does Ukraine feel with the confused Europe?
Thank you very much. Well, in a way, Europe is confused if I talk about kind of political role of Europe. On the other way, we know that Europe is strong for being a technical actor, if you want, an actor to support reforms, to support institutional processes. And in that sense, I think Europe is doing more or less a good job. It has increased funding to Ukraine together with other international organizations like World Bank and EBRD. It has strengthened its conditionality, which I find is very important. Basically, the money are not given just like this, but they are divided into tranches, and each tranche or portion is attached to specific conditions, reform conditions. And unfortunately, they're not public. It has to be public, but media manages to leak this information, which is very important. And this is an important factor, I think. Finally, we shouldn't forget that it is the European Union, its member states, US as well, of course, for many years have supported Ukraine's civil society, development of civil society. And what we see now, unprecedentedly strong civil society in Ukraine, which exercises enormous pressure on public authorities, following on daily basis what the parliament is doing, what the government is doing on a very bureaucratic, very detailed basis, making this information public and demanding donors to exercise more pressure. This is a very important factor, and we can attribute it to the support EU has done for civil society in Ukraine for 2 decades at least. Yeah. So I think we cannot. It's not black and white. Yeah, the role of the European Union. Europe turned out to be weak as a political actor. Here we see as an actor who can contain Russia and can help countries like Ukraine pay security costs which come with the European choice, as we have seen, right? But in this sense, maybe some member states compensate. So France, Germany is playing a leading role here, yeah, this helps. But I think in the long-term perspective, it's about changing the system of governance, and here EU is contributing in a very important way.
Just a short follow-up question. What is, in terms of public opinion, the support for the European Union, and how do Ukrainians feel about Russia?
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. It's an important question. Actually, public opinion changed dramatically in May 2014. So basically, annexation of Crimea and the start of the war in eastern Ukraine was a big game changer. Support for the European Union increased dramatically. Support for the feeling of being proud of being Ukrainian increased dramatically. Many of these people are Russian-speaking. This is an important point to be mentioned, who feel they are politically Ukrainians. Interestingly, support for nation, people who support accession to NATO, this percentage is bigger than those who do not support, and this is the first time ever Ukraine has this result of the public opinion. So I think it's really Russian aggression which changed this perception. To some extent Euromaidan, but it was largely that. So now society at large is very pro-European. Yeah.
Thank you. Mr. Pirinski, allow me to make a follow-up question to you as well. In what we're outlining as a very tough neighborhood on the Black Sea region, how do we accommodate in the region, based on cooperation, both the European Union, but also Russia, with the other neighboring countries on the Black Sea?
Thank you for that question. Basically, I feel that when we think for an answer to that challenge, it is important to consider the starting point from which we try to arrive at the answer. And I believe that the starting point should be a careful assessment of what I would call the enlightened self-interest or enlightened national interest or state interest of the different, perhaps, protagonists. And if we talk about Russia, what Andrey Makarychev described as a series of very provocative policies, and just now the reference to the events in Ukraine, would seem to indicate that Russia is interested in an aggressive stance, pushing as far as possible the limits of its power. And clearly, there is probably a party in Russia which would subscribe precisely to that view as the best option for Russia. I'm not sure whether the Russian president and an important part of the elite there see it quite that way. To make a long story short, I believe that under certain terms, Russia would be interested in a global partnership with the United States and NATO, since, again, I believe that predominant preoccupation of the Russian ruling elite is one, what they would feel arrangements which are sufficiently acceptable from the point of view of external threats to national security, and you know the preoccupations there, and also internally of building a more cohesive society which is viable in the longer run, recognizing all the divisive tendencies there. On the part of the European Union, I believe that clearly there is every interest in building a relationship which would permit, first of all, the Union and its member states to feel sufficiently secure, and especially those members that now express a very acute sense of unease, to say the least, those in the Baltics and Poland, which would come from a clear behavior on the part of Russia of a non-threatening nature. And, of course, opportunity to engage in active cooperation with both the Eastern Partner States and the Russian Federation in developing a democratic culture of international relations. So how do we go about doing that? Again, I would venture that the notion could be another European macro-region which would be inclusive and which perhaps, following up on Mr. Giragosian's notion of, he was talking about containment and engagement, perhaps such a stance could combine the two in a positive direction.
Thank you very much. Speaking of recommendations about how EU's policy towards the region should look like, what would you say in a couple of words? What should definitely be part of what the global strategy looks like when it speaks about the region and its challenges? Iryna, I'll turn to you first.
Can you please...
Sure. What, from the point of view of Ukraine, what should be the recommendations that you would draft, let's say, as of how the strategy should be addressing Ukraine and the region?
Mm-hmm. Well, there are now kind of attempts, or Europe is questioning its approach towards the region, which was shaped by the Eastern Partnership. So there is now an attempt to revise this. And I think it's a dangerous process in the sense that I think the ambitions formulated initially by the Eastern Partnership policy, that of transforming the countries, making them well-governed, democratic, prosperous, the ambition itself is a good one. It should be preserved, and the question is how then you update the tools to meet the demands and situations in different countries. And here also I see a dangerous trend treating countries or equating countries with their governments. So, for instance, I hear a lot from EU institutions, well, Armenia doesn't want that close cooperation, so we should then listen what Armenia wants here and update our requirements. I think, but then it misses the point that there is a part of society in Armenia which thinks differently and which aspires European values, which wants changes to happen. And if EU is not listening to this part of society, is not supporting this part, not empowering this part in the domestic context, then it misses the opportunity to make a difference in the longer run when there is a political climate or context changes. So I think there should be a stronger differentiation between governments and societies in these countries on the side of the EU, and stronger differentiation between countries, but not equating governments with society. Yeah. And Eastern Partnership as a framework, I think, should be preserved, but tools have to be, of course, updated. Yeah.
Thank you. Richard Giragosian, Armenia, what should be your recommendations? Is the partnership still as useful as it was?
I would say yes, in many ways, although I do want to reiterate the fact that the EU is not the answer to all of our solutions. Much of the challenge is on the citizens themselves. Having said that, specifically there are 3 areas of recommendation. The first is consistency, and it's unfortunate that in many ways consistency has been far too lacking on behalf of the EU and the West. Consistency in terms of a constant message, whether it's in Ukraine's case, conditionality, which is very important. But secondly, aside from consistency, connectivity. That's a big word, it's a big jargon lexicon used in many events in Brussels where we don't even know what it means. What I'm talking about for connectivity is specifically networking between and among civil society organizations in each of the Eastern Partnership countries, so that there's a bigger effort from a bottom-up perspective to strengthen the Eastern Partnership, networking in terms of connectivity. And beyond consistency and the need for connectivity is communications. Because in many ways, one lesson from Armenia in this Eastern Partnership was we made 2 mistakes when Armenia suddenly, unilaterally, conducted a U-turn in its strategic policy and forfeited 3.5 years of negotiations over an association agreement. The mistake by us in civil society was complacency. We didn't see this coming. For 3.5 years, Russia did not oppose the Eastern Partnership. It was a very belated U-turn in Moscow first. But in terms of communication strategy, the second mistake was the EU did a very bad job in articulating and reiterating what are the specific dividends, what are the specific benefits for the ordinary citizen and the ordinary consumer. There wasn't enough done to define and defend European values for the ordinary citizen. This lack of a communication strategy only fostered and forged Russia's use of its own soft power in putting forth a distorted message of what European values are not. And in many ways, the communications strategy is perhaps the undervalued and undermet requirement of Eastern Partnership. Thank you.
Thank you. Ghia, Nodia, Georgia's recommendations.
Okay, I cannot say Georgia's, but my recommendations or my view would be that, first of all, I agreed with what was said already in terms of more intense and more nuanced communications and networking and connectivity on the level of governments or civil society or political classes, if you wish, having in mind communications with opposition as well and business communities, etc. It's never enough and very important. But on more kind of big political level, I would say that clarity and consistency of message is very important. And this clarity and consistency is not just about communication techniques, it's about, first of all, recognizing realities, which I think Europe has not been good at for a long time. I mean, to remember recent history of 2008 war, Europe was basically in denial of reality in many ways, that trying to write this off or explain it away by some kind of excessive emotionality of certain political leaders on the both sides or these kind of things, and not recognizing that Russia considers the West, including Europe, as kind of opponent or maybe enemy, and it's not just about adjusting some technicalities. I think Ukraine, of course, did a lot. Ukrainian crisis did a lot to force Europe to recognize that reality, but still it's not, I think, there is too much of blaming itself for not being clear about something, or somehow this is another way to avoid reality that whatever Europe thinks, Russia, as Andrey said very well, I think, just works in different paradigm. And within that paradigm, the very European idea of kind of post-Westphalian order is inimical to Russia's view. And so Europe has no other option in that reality to recognize that it's the relations with Russia should be based on the kind of idea of containment, and one should not deceive oneself about meeting Russia halfway or somehow constructive cooperation and partnership, etc. The only halfway acceptable for Russia is kind of new Yalta agreement, basically, and Russia does not hide it so much, and somehow accepting this kind of thing would mean negation of the very idea of Europe. So there should be some clarity, but also, of course, this implies clarity on what Europe can and cannot do. And I agree that Europe cannot do everything, but if it cannot do everything, it should be clear also of what it can do and what it cannot. And I think there are too many ambiguities, sometimes constructive ambiguities, sometimes not so constructive ambiguities on these points. And last but not least, I know it's not always a popular point, but I think that especially when it comes to contestation and containment, and provided limitations of European structures, strengthening transatlantic cooperation should be given greater weight, let's say, in European strategies. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Tough love, this is how analysts sometimes call the relationship between the EU and Russia. So beyond sanctions, what should the EU be doing with Russia?
Well, as I mentioned, the most important thing is to face the reality and to understand that, in fact, Putin made his choice, and this choice is in favor of isolation. So there is not much that can be directly done with this challenge, but indirectly, of course, some pathways are still open. I think the European Union has to avoid not only wishful thinking, as I mentioned, but also this business-as-usual type of paradigm, the Russia-first policy, which sometimes is still very persistent in individual member states. The European Union has to recognize that the idea of Wanderduschhandel does not work, etc. So that would be just starting points. And concerning my previous statement of refocusing attention from Russia to those countries who would like to more intensely cooperate with the European Union, well, I would definitely think that it would be a very useful and good idea to keep going ahead with the implementation of association agreements with countries such as Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova. And I think again that I know that there is a skepticism about Black Sea region, but in the meantime, I do see some preconditions for kind of maybe a second or a third trying out of the regional cooperation, because countries like Georgia and the Ukraine that are Black Sea countries, they need maybe another kind of pathway to Europe. And in this sense, for them, the Black Sea, a kind of renewed type of Black Sea regionalism, can be one of those pathways to Europe, under the conditions that countries like Romania and Bulgaria would take a more active stand in this direction, which might be to some extent parallel with the role which Poland and Finland more than a decade ago played with regard to the Eastern Partnership, generating and initiating Eastern Partnership and the Northern Dimension initiative.
Thank you very much. And with this, I would turn to the broader roundtable for questions to the few panelists, but also for personal insights and for further discussion. Mr. Krasnostanchev,
Thank you. I wanted to ask two questions, probably. One is to Ghia. I know Georgia relatively well, and I got the feeling that Georgian example is very useful for many other countries from the post-Soviet Union area. But then thinking of this question, I realized that first the reason of not recognizing Georgia as such a good example is probably outside Georgia, and that's partially the European Union. And then I believe that European Union, given the context of Russia's non-recognition of the post-Soviet Union realities and international rule of law, had towards the eastern neighbors, mildly speaking, very much inadequate policies, including the neighborhood policy. I believe that those countries would have benefited from unilateral trade liberalization, similar to the Union's trade liberalization towards the Western Balkans, which happened after the ex-Yugoslav wars and the Kosovo crisis. And the second thing which would benefit these countries would have been non-visa regime. So on these two, in my point of view, very important policies, the Union had never delivered. And in fact, the lack of trade liberalization and even some complication of the trade relations with Eastern neighborhood through the so-called deep and comprehensive free trade agreements were to be blamed to some of the events, not so much the Georgian story of 2008, but very much the Ukrainian story of 2013 and 14. Thank you.
Let's gather a few more questions.
Thanks.
Can I please only ask you to introduce yourself shortly?
My name is Dimitri Triantafilou from Kadir Has University in Istanbul. It's been a very interesting session, and I think you've had a couple of extreme positions. I mean, how do you reconcile what Andrey Makarychev talks about, which is, we have to come and realize the truth, and that Russia is in favor of isolationism, and therefore we might have to contain it, or I think container is a word used by Ghia Nodia as well. And therefore what we need to do is work closer with the countries in the region that want to work with the EU, and a broader vision, which has always been part and parcel of what the EU is trying to do. And I think Georgi Pirinski has expressed a broader vision. His whole concept of linking the spaces, the BSEC space with the SECP space is very interesting in that sense. Because even though those are regional initiatives, they're not EU-led, but nevertheless, it's what the EU has always talked about, right? And so the EU, as it's reviewing its foreign policy, has to consider something. I mean, just because Russia has taken the stand, therefore, do we react and say the only thing forward is to deal with Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia that have come closer to us and leave the rest on their own? Or do we also take a proactive stand and initiative? And I think one can reconcile and have both. Both. One needs to have both. One cannot just one over the other. And I think as we are formulating, as the EU is formulating its foreign policy, it has to consider that. There is an element, there is a reality with what Russia is doing. There is a reality of countries in the region wanting to come closer. But the reality is that our principles say we have to work together. Because if we don't exist. Right? And I think this is where we need to focus. And I would take your two extremes and try to put them together. And I think this is the framework within which the EU should probably try to operate. Thanks.
Thank you.
Senada Šelošabić, Institute for International Relations from Croatia. Dimitrios actually asked what I wanted to ask, to compare the two opposite views on Russia. But now, in reply to what you asked, whether we can have both or how to have both things at play at the same time, I'm not sure it is possible. And therefore, I actually have a question to Mr. Pirinski, because what Mr. Makarychev was saying is actually in line what the ECFR paper on the revision of the European security strategy advises, a tough love towards Russia. So this is basically this view. But you, Mr. Pirinski, said that Russia is interested in global partnership, including United States and Europe. So I'm wondering, how do you see it, or where do you see the intention to have partnership and be constructive partner in the global security issues?
Thank you. Tornike Sharashendze from Georgia. I want to address my question to Dr. Makarychev, since soft power is one of your interests, as I have seen it here. Richard actually touched this issue, Russian soft power offensive. How do you see the EU reacting to the Russian soft power offensive? I think the EU is being pretty slow with that, and we know that actually Russia's soft power offensive started a long time ago, when Russia Today actually came to existence, and nobody actually reacted in the West. What do you think? How would you use the experience of countries like Georgia, Ukraine, and Armenia and Moldova? They're special cases. Each of them are special cases for Russian soft power offensive, so to say. How could you, the European Union, somehow, let's say, take some benefit from the experience of these countries, benefit in a way, so to say, to shape a soft power strategy to counter Russia?
I'm happy to take one more question. Yes, please.
So maybe very Haki Abazi from Rockefeller Brothers Fund for Western Balkans. Two quick interventions on the self-isolation of Russia, and I think in a way maybe until like a couple of months ago that would be an accepted notion, but with the new investment bank and initiative where China, Russia, Brazil, and India are introducing a new way of engagement, I think from the self-isolation political position of Russia, we're moving to a bipolar financial competition in the world, which I think will introduce a huge level of complexity for our region, both Western Balkans and the Black Sea region. And I think EU's position on that is going to be critical in coming years because of the resources management and what I think part of our discussion will be later on how this region of Europe has been the clash between Russia and Europe, but also the United States in terms of being considered as an energy corridor, and moving from the time of pipelines to the seaports, where I think critically Russia's position is being articulated, considering the contribution and the fight in Syria and also losing the gravity in terms of the control of the Libyan seaports as well. So in that context, I think, and I would like to hear the reaction from Andrey on that, because I don't think we're talking the self-isolation. On the political level, I think EU has to be very strategic of where the clash with Russia is going to be and how that's going to look like. Is it going to be waiting and in a very unpredictable way to see if it's going to be next Moldova or Baltic countries, or what I would prefer the clash to be in United Nations and Security Council, where I think Russia has had the green light to keep the strong position. We saw what happened in Srebrenica, and I think UN, in a very kind of a fashionable way, does kind of kill the debate out there. Therefore, we go back and we see Ukraine, we see Chechnya, and we see Syria being the sacrifice and the victim of a process that is not actually happening at the global governance institutions such as UN.
Thank you. Ghia, please.
Okay, first I will address this issue which Krasen mentioned on kind of Georgia not being appreciated, let's say so, through granting visa liberalization or liberalization of trade regimes. Okay, I think the issue here is that generally, of course, there is big issue, of relations between different Georgian governments and Brussels, but there is also an issue of how that this kind of supposedly technical criteria, whether Georgia has carried out enough reforms to qualify for visa liberalization or some other kind of liberalization or not yet, and it has to do more reforms. I think it's kind of obvious that its threshold is kind of arbitrary and can be moved up and down due to political considerations. And at least I think everybody in Georgia interpreted a denial of visa-free regime to Georgia in Riga summit, that there were some, whatever, political considerations were there. And it's also kind of European realpolitik or EU realpolitik. We have to accept what EU gives us or refuses us. The power of Georgia is limited in that case. But I think the key problem maybe is whether and how that affects commitment of Georgia to European project. I think some people kind of quote Turkish example that this kind of carrot of European integration was being dangled in front of Turkey like 1963, and at some point Turkey just got tired of that and said, okay, we'll look to Middle East and play some roles there, and the Europeans don't want us. I think Georgia is far from that critical kind of point, and I think, and also because we cannot play neo-Ottoman role in we don't have that kind of option. But generally, yes, I think this kind of obviously geopolitical postponements, whether on behalf of NATO for MAP or on behalf of European Union for visa-free regime, I think it creates some kind of cynicism that they come up with ever new excuses just because they don't have political will. And I think that's kind of fair assessment. But I also wanted to react, although it was not addressed to me, on this issue of Russian self-isolation, isolation, and how then, what is this BRICS business about? I would not maybe use the term self-isolation, but I think that I agree generally with Andrey's position. For Russia's mind, let's say so, since Peter the Great, like for last 3 centuries and so, the world is mostly West and Western international community, and Russia wants to find its place within this world and be recognized in its world on its own rules and conditions, but somehow keeps failing to be recognized there, especially in post-World War period. And as I said, the Yalta Agreement was somehow more or less acceptable way of being recognized, and that Russia cannot get. And so when we say or somebody says isolation, it means isolation from the West. So isolation, self-isolation from Western projects, while projects like BRICS, it's still questionable whether it can fly as a kind of real kind of opposing pole to the West. There is World Bank and there is BRICS, and they can compete somehow as equals. I mean, who knows whether it works, but I'm afraid that Russia will be pressed or doomed to play second fiddle to China And I am not sure that Russians will be happy about that too. I think we should not overestimate these kinds of political projects.
Thank you. Mr. Pirinski, I would turn to you for an answer.
Thank you. Well, first of all, on the notion of the two opposing views across the length of the table, actually, I would venture that we are not all that far apart, because at the end of Mr. Makarychev's intervention, he pointed out the format of regional cooperation as a possible vehicle for reinvigorating a pro-European process. And you are quite right that both the BISEC and the SECP have as a founding direction in them a European orientation. Furthermore, what you pointed out as the possibility of individual countries in the regions that are members playing a very active role vis-à-vis those countries that are in the region and show an interest in developing an active European perspective. So, as I think Mr. Triandafoglu pointed out, one does not exclude the other. Now, as to the second debating point, which our colleague from Croatia also pointed out, can we at all think about any sort of partnership, etc., etc., I was referring to what is clearly a constant preoccupation of the Russian leadership, of this balance of power at the highest level of missile defenses and potential second strike capabilities, where I believe that there always is an ongoing careful evaluation of how far does the, let's say, Russian side feel threatened by an overwhelming first strike presence on the part of the United States. And I believe that it would be in the enlightened self-interest of a Putin regime to find an acceptable balance. Now, we come to the third aspect, which was mentioned. Is that a tough policy towards Russia? Is that a appeasement policy towards Russia? Is that a balanced and justified policy that could be advisable? I believe that it is thinkable in the sense of an acceptable balance of interests, and I believe that we have just had a demonstration of that in the case of the negotiations with Iran, where the 6 countries found sufficient common interest to tackle a most contentious, precisely nuclear issue. And I would not exclude the same type of approach being applied on the global level, because, as Mr. Makarychev pointed out, there is this global dimension to the regional and bilateral and single country predicaments, which unavoidably presses upon and casts its shadow over the individual processes and developments. To make a long story short, there are these 3 levels of challenges. One is the global one, and there I believe the European Union and Ms. Mogherini should be playing the type of role that she has been playing in the Iran affair, of trying to build an acceptable common position vis-a-vis a challenge. Then there is the regional dimension, and I believe that these 2 formats, BISEC and SECP, can be useful building blocks, with the understanding that within them you develop a set of bilateral relations. And then comes the sectoral dimension. Further on in the conference, there will be a discussion of the energy aspect and other connectivity, in whatever sense you like to take it, formats, where, again, one of the points that even within the discussion of the European Union strategic initiative is being made, that there is this need for a regionalization of cooperation in the electricity, let's say, transmission field, and of course the pipeline area, etc., interconnectivity, where again it is a question of building up a European capacity of functioning within the European Union. And the macro-regional overarching format, I believe, is a enabling perspective which would make a kind of belonging to a clearly pro-European process and see what type of stance Russia would take. There is an important role for Turkey to play in this sense because it is a powerful regional and trans-regional factor. It is very much interested in opening chapters and engaging in a negotiation. This is something ongoing in the European Parliament. I'm a member of the Friends of Turkey group at European Parliament, and we have these periodic discussions as to why aren't chapters being opened, what are the blockages. Again, there can be an invitation to Turkey to show a clear pro-European commitment. Yes, Louisa, I see you watching me.
Thank you very much. Andrey, in 2 minutes, please.
Well, first of all, I think I need to a little bit specify this isolation thing because it fueled a little bit of debate.
As long as it's in 2 minutes.
Yeah, but I just wanted to say that you should not take definitely this isolation trend as a steady one. It's very precarious, and there are so many issues, so many unknowns, so many wild cards that might kind of shift this balance in one or another direction, including the state of relations with China, and Russia might be disappointed at a certain time with that, and other many things which can also move Russia either towards abandoning this isolationist position or vice versa to even enhance it. Concerning soft power, I think this is an important issue, but to be brief, well, I would say that, and this is based on my empirical studies in some of the post-Soviet countries, that Russia and the European Union, using the concept of soft power, in fact, they mean quite different concept, different issues by that. In the European Union, or from the European Union perspective, soft power is basically about fostering liberal changes in the society. So the whole idea of soft power has a lot to do with this liberal background. In the case of Russia, it's the other way around. It's very conservative. It contains a very strong religious components, and it does not aim to foster any changes in the societies that are objects of Russian soft power. This is a very, very important point. The European Union wants to create a new reality. I'm not discussing whether it succeeds or not. Russia takes its partners as they are without being too demanding. In the Russian soft power, what prevails is kind of imperial imposition in the case of Armenia. Not only Armenia, are very much telling in this respect. In the case of the European Union, it's basically about practices of governance. It's completely different thing. So I don't think that Russian and European soft powers, they really kind of overlap or coincide. They have different audiences, they have different methods, and they have different concepts behind them. And of course, there is one more important dimension. What sometimes is behind Russian soft power is hard power. And people do know that. And this is not the case of the European Union. And people also do know that.
Thank you. In the last couple of minutes, I will want to turn to a Turkish participant, and I do see Iryna sitting to my right, because we're lacking the perspective of another big player in the region.
Thank you, Louisa. Actually, I'm not expert in the Black Sea region, but I was really wondering when I just hear Richard's comment on the as a game changer Turkish-Armenian reconciliation or normalization process, and I was thinking, will that be do we see the light in the tunnel at first, and that will be also affect the sort of normalization the Turkish accession process with the EU. So that I may just highlight the debate. And I did realize during this debate, although that we are talking the EU's role in the Black Sea region, and we have also highlighted Russia's role as the global vocation. So I was wondering a little bit more and hearing more about our expert, the vision of U.S. and the U.S. position in the region as well.
Thank you. I would gather if... Yes, please, Iryna.
I would like to make one point because I think we kind of a bit missed. We haven't talked about really one more objective which you could pursue, producing a change in Russia. And that's why the controversy around the word containment or non-cooperation with Russia emerged. I think if we think about containment as a tool towards producing a change in Russia, towards producing some sort of elite split, towards producing unsatisfaction in the society in Russia, towards the regime, then it's actually a constructive policy. During the Maidan process in Ukraine, one of the slogans from the early days was Russia stand up or Russia rise up. So there seems to be a collective unconsciousness in Ukraine which implies that without Russian regime change, or without the Russian system being changed, there is no possibility for having peace and stability in this region. So I think this is what the end goal should be, and you should not forget about this when we talk about containment.
Thank you very much. I would gather a final round of questions, but I would rather look at our participants to the back. So if there are any questions from our participants who are here as observers, this is the chance to ask them.
Hi, thank you. Stuart Summers from the European External Action Service. I actually have one comment just on the communications point, which I think is well made, and I think we understand that. And I rather hope personally that this global strategy that we're working on will form quite a useful foundation for our better communication in the future, not just with the foreign policy community, but also with ordinary citizens, both in the European Union and outside. So that's just a comment on comms. Just on Iran, actually part of my question, which I had planned, has been stolen by Mr. Pirinski's answer. But I wanted to ask, I think our Armenian colleague mentioned that Iran and the deal had a effect. And I wondered whether you could say whether that was the fact that it provided an opportunity as a format to solve other regional issues, or whether it showed a willingness amongst Russia and, say, the US to work together. Would that be something that would be an issue-by-issue basis, or something more broadly than that? Or is it more about the economics of a deal possibly invigorating the region, the Black Sea region, through sort of knock-on effects? I'd just be interested to hear your views on that. Thank you.
Two more questions. Vesela.
I want to come back to what Ghia mentioned about Yalta and the spheres of influence. At the same time, you talked about the lack of direction. And when I was listening to you, I was wondering, isn't it that we actually want a little bit too much from the EU? If we are serious about how much the EU can do, we might end up with a new spheres of influence situation. The EU could say probably, we're going to work with those countries who really desire coming closer to the EU, countries like Ukraine, countries like Georgia, but maybe we will be less inclined to spend resources, efforts, political capital on others who are actually not that prone to cooperate. And we would probably spare some of the confrontation we would otherwise walk into with Russia over those countries. So isn't this a kind of a double-edged sword? And ECFR had a delegation in Minsk 2 months ago where our Belarusian counterparts were saying basically, oh, the EU, no, thank you very much. Look what you did in Ukraine. I mean, you basically ruined a very nice country. You drove it into war and so on. So no, it's for us, this was the end of any illusions that we might have had with the EU. Turning around this argument, I think we should recognize that there are very concrete things that people from the region would expect from the EU. and there are limits to how much the EU can do. So maybe over-wishing is also kind of not the best recipe.
Thank you. And I'll hand back to our speakers for final remarks. Ghia, please.
Okay, starting what you can do and what you cannot do. Okay, there is no clarity about it kind of objectively, because what changed was also kind of normative power balance, and I think assumptions that everybody wants to be part of EU is no longer kind of, that there is no expectation like that. But when you say about that, in a way suggests that if EU concentrates of countries which really have expressed commitment to EU project, let's say so, and maybe pay less attention to those who don't, I don't think that would be like a new Yalta agreement, and I don't think that would make Russia happy, basically, because that assumes that EU, that the choice of working with the EU or not lies with the political will or wish of those countries themselves, that Ukrainians and Georgians are free to decide they want to be with the EU or they want to be with Russia. And that's exactly what Russia contests. It does not recognize even the fact that Ukrainians organized this Euromaidan. They think that Americans organized Euromaidan by paying Ukrainians. So this, I do agree that Europe should recognize more clearly, I think, and in a sense distinguish more clearly between nations which want to follow European path and not follow European path. Somehow Europe was reluctant to even formally recognize that. But it is that kind of recognition would not satisfy Russia and would not fit into Russia's view of new Yalta agreement anyway.
Thank you. Richard?
It's very dangerous to stand between the participants and the coffee break, so I'll be brief. First, for Vanya's question, the outlook for Armenia-Turkey normalization and as a game changer is very positive. I'll go into details privately and also to save time. The second question regarding U.S. policy. Being a former government official, one advantage is I can be honest. And although I'm a Democrat, having moved to Armenia during the Bush administration, it made it much more attractive. As a Democrat, I'm increasingly frustrated with President Obama. There is no U.S. policy in the Caucasus. It's very much a subset of U.S.-Russian relations. We in the U.S. for a long time were looking at the Eastern Partnership as a way to have the European Union fill the vacuum as we retreated. In many ways, we didn't perhaps support enough or vocally enough the Eastern Partnership. But the concrete answer, unfortunately, is there is still a lack of consistency and commitment by the U.S. in the South Caucasus within the broader region. We haven't actually solved that calculus yet. And my third point, which was raised by our colleague from the European External Action Service, the Iran breakthrough is a game changer in many ways, not only because of policy, but because of process. In the short term, there were two losers from the Iran deal, Netanyahu in Israel and Putin in Moscow. The Iranians are much more interested in re-engagement in the world, the global economy, and with the West. Russia is much less important in this context. Turkey is more important, however. And in the medium term, there are several sub-areas where the U.S. and Russia or the West and Russia can still cooperate. Nagorno-Karabakh, the unresolved conflict, is an exception. It is an area where Russia is still cooperative with the West. Iran over the medium term as well. A third area is actually in terms of Russia not blocking Armenia-Turkish normalization. And what's also important, going back to the U.S., there is an example of Cuba, the establishment of diplomatic relations and engagement, the real reason behind that had little to do with Cuba and more to do with Iran and more to do with an exercise in re-engaging, almost post-conflict or post-sanctions, and a fresh start. What we should expect in the coming months is yet another half-hearted attempt at a reset to the reset, and it probably won't work. Hence, the efforts of Mogherini, the External Action Service, at providing an updated strategic vision are actually that much more important. Thank you.
Thank you. Andrey, 1 minute.
A little bit of optimism before coffee break. Well, my final statement would be that the good news is that we should not overestimate and overrate the abilities of Putin's regime to impose its own vision of reality upon either big partners like the European Union or the States or upon its neighbors. And we also need to see that in many respects Putin's policy are self-defeating and counterproductive. This is very much the case of Georgia. This is very much the case of Ukraine, and the growing presence of NATO troops in the Baltic states, for example, is a very good indication of how counterproductive Putin's policy can be, even as seen from the priorities of this distorted reality itself. Which means that to some extent the most paradoxical conclusion is that Russia remains very much a postmodernist type of actor that is unable to produce consistent and coherent discourses, and sometimes it's kind of lost between 2 or 3 or even 4 priorities, again without being able to generate comprehensible and consistent type of policy.
Iryna?
My final statement would be that EU should, by all means, keep up to its ambition to promote stability, democracy, and good governance in the region. And this also concerns Russia. Let's not forget that before European Neighbourhood Policy was launched, there was a document, Wider Europe strategy or initiative, and it included Russia as well, but that Russia opted out. And in Ukraine, actually, the current developments in Russia are often viewed as a final stage of the process of collapse of Russian Empire, which started during the First World War. I don't know, it might be too ambitious, but this is also a view which is often produced in Ukraine, and if this is the case, then there is a chance also for the EU to make a difference, to have a different Russia, which would make a difference for the whole region.
Thank you very much. Now, please join me in thanking not only the panelists, but also the other contributors to the book which you found in your folders. And thank you very much for being with us for this panel.